So the job that I had before I entered seminary was actually partly there when I was in seminary. I worked at a big corporation, at AT&T. I worked in the oh-so-thrilling department of environmental health and safety. And it was a lot of fun and good people. I worked with very good people. And my boss, at least at first, was a wonderful young woman named Brenna. And Brenna is actually the person who introduced me to Unitarian Universalism, interesting enough. But that's not my story today. Brenna was a very interesting person in our department. She was one of the youngest people in the department, but she had a great deal of responsibility, and she was an incredibly competent, smart person. I really enjoyed working with her. I remember at the time, I think I was in my mid-30s, and she was probably in her late 20s. Because of her position and what she did, she was asked to run a really big project in the department that took into account all sorts of different things around governmental regulations and everything. And it was sort of new for the department, and in order to get it all in shape, we had to bring in people who were normally out in the field doing environmental health and safety inspections, that sort of thing, bring them into our office for almost a month to get this all up and running, and she was going to be the one to run it. Well, all of these people who came in working from the field, all of these were sort of big, sort of burly, blue-collar workers, right? And I don't think they were very happy about being there in the first place, but every morning and every afternoon, we would meet in a conference room to get sort of updates and discuss issues and get sort of our marching orders from her. Now, unfortunately, these big burly guys did not take kindly to a younger woman running the meetings. She was the one who was supposed to be solving the problems and telling them what to do, and they questioned every decision that she made. They were passive-aggressive about doing their work. Oh, you wanted me to do that? I thought you wanted me to, that kind of thing. And they tried to go around her to her boss, Don, and they were often complaining about her to him. It was obviously very frustrating for her. And after about 2 weeks of this behavior, with resentment building on both sides, in the afternoon meeting, I remember it was around 4 o'clock, there was this big blow-up in the meeting. And actually Don, bless his heart, her boss, soundly chastised the men and said, no, you will listen to her. She is in charge of this. More resentment. I remember after this blow-up meeting, Brenna came to me and she said, could you come in early tomorrow, Sean? I want to do something. Okay, sure. So I came in early the next morning, and she said, we're going to rearrange the conference room. Okay, sure. So that's what we did. We moved the chairs around. We moved where the front of the room was to a different front of the room, and Post-it notes that were up and around we moved everything around. And she told me, she said, sometimes to shake up people, to get them out of their pattern of thinking, you need to shake up their environment. And sure enough, she was right. By the time everyone arrived, Brenna and I were sitting in different spots than we normally would sit in. And I remember sort of the ringleader of this group of guys, he kind of swaggered in, and he couldn't quite figure out, it was all the same and yet different. He couldn't quite figure out what was going on. He looked rather confused, and you could almost see him trying to figure this out. And he couldn't sit with his buddies in kind of a clique or anything like that because of where we were sitting. So he and his buddies were coming in there concentrating, trying to figure out what had changed and why, rather than their resentment. And amazingly enough, after that, the project went much more smoothly. It wasn't like they suddenly became buddy friends or anything like that, but that resentment, that passive-aggressive stuff stopped. And it taught me something kind of interesting. If you're in a rut, if you're thinking or in your life, it's not a bad idea to simply change and shake up your environment. Have any of you ever done this, right? Where you've rearranged your furniture in your bedroom or your living room? Anybody ever done that? Just to kind of make it a little new, something a little bit different. It kind of helps. It makes it feel moving the energy around. This church did that 5 years ago, right? You moved from this space, from that space to this space, and it shook up some of the energy. Now, we don't always think about our environment, right, and how it can affect us. Something we just sort of walk through the world in. But it can help get us out of ruts in our thinking, break up our routines, and help us see things often from a different perspective. And environments can also give us focus, even in a very busy, hectic world. Having a clean house or an area where you can focus is helpful. I remember I learned this in high school. My friend Heather, when I would go to visit her, she would always bring her homework. We would sit down and do it. She said, no, we do it at the dining room table. I was like, okay, I always did my homework in my room. Like, why the dining room table? And for those of you who are parents, you probably know why, because her room was a mess. And the one place where there wasn't anything to distract her was on the dining room table, so that's where she learned to do her homework, which I thought was rather clever. And even in my home, right, I have a corner in my apartment. I have a small apartment, but I have a corner where is my art corner. And when I'm there, I do art. But my computer is on the way other side of the room. It's a large room. That's where so I can't get distracted by the computer if I'm doing my art, and vice versa. If I'm working on my sermon or doing something like that, I'm not distracted by my art. Having separate areas of my house is conducive to what I want to do, and it helps me stay focused. And again, we don't think about our environments that we inhabit that much. We go from one to the other, rarely aware of how we, and when we do. So for example, we go from home to work, and we're often different people in them, right? Our behaviors might change somewhat. And there are cues that each of us has that tell us how to behave in different environments. Some of them are quite powerful. For example, have you ever walked into, say, an empty cathedral, right? And suddenly you still start talking in a whisper. Right? Sometimes our environments have these powerful cues. You know, our church, we're going to be launching a capital campaign to build a new sanctuary. This room is the room actually we plan on eating in. And we're going to be building a new sanctuary over there. And it'll be really interesting. How are we thinking about how that space will help people create community, be welcoming, give a sense of holiness? What is it that we want that space to tell people and for us to have it? Do we want to whisper in it, or do we want to shout with joy? It's going to be an interesting question to ask. So, though many of us aren't always consciously aware of the effect our environments have on us, most people, unconsciously, we choose our environments. So, for example, your home most likely reflects who you are, or at least who you would like to be perceived as. And a church reflects its people as well. Our environments support who we are or how we want to be perceived. I think it's a little bit like Ferdinand in our story. The flowers in the field made him mellow, and that's where he wanted to be, so that's where he was always going to be, not in the bullring. So if environments support and nurture who we are and want to be, sometimes the opposite is also true. Our environments can hold us back and keep us from whom we want to be in the future. There's this guy named Jim Rohn. Some of you may know it. He has this famous saying, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Think about that for just a moment. Think of the 5 people that you spend the most time with, and are you an average of them? I'm not sure entirely what that means, but I thought it was kind of an interesting statistic. You know, for example, also new studies have come out that shows that if you want to change a habit or learn something new, changing your environment is almost mandatory. So on the one hand, if you want to learn, say, a new hobby, taking a class or hanging out with people, those that do that hobby will help. But on the flip side, if your friends have bad habits, for example, either if they eat unhealthily or smoke or do drugs, chances are you're going to do that too. Matter of fact, I told my twin sister about this quote, and she stopped to think about it. Now, my sister struggles with her weight, as I do. She's actually quite a bit larger than I am, and she's been trying desperately to lose weight, and she was thinking about it. She's like, wow, okay, so the people I hang out with, they're quilters, because she's a big quilter, and most of them are obese. It's like, oh, click, something's going on there. That's who she hangs out with. So does that mean that we have to change our friends to change our habits? And I think for some people, the answer may be very much yes. changing our environment also means the people that we're hanging out with. In fact, there's been this study that's called the Equality of Opportunity Project. It's out of Harvard University, led by these economics professors, Dr. Raj Chetty and Dr. Nathaniel Hendren. Basically what they did is they looked at 50 million children, okay? And it's not a small sample size, 50 million children and their parents, and they mapped upward mobility of a child growing up in the US by county with poor parents, those in the 20th percentile of income. They did this by county, and they found that they could predict a child's potential income based on where they grew up. So this is the map they came up with, right? In other words, if the American dream is in part to exceed your parents' income, this map charts the likelihood of that happening. The lighter areas show where it's more likely, and the darker, less likely. Interesting, isn't it? They can predict down to a county your likelihood of whether or not you're going to exceed your parents' income if you grew up in that lower percentile of 20%. So some counties give you a fighting chance to change your socioeconomic status, and others do not. Your specific environment of origin, where you grew up with, has a direct measurable impact on the rest of your life. And I found this fascinating because it sort of jives a lot also with what J.D. Vance is talking about, the author of our reading, when he was talking about Brian. Looking at this map, Vance had a very low chance of exceeding his parents' income, so he grew up in sort of the Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio area, which is very dark red there. He had a very low chance of succeeding at the American dream. Vance did it by finally getting out of his environment. For him, there were a number of good cards that were dealt to him, so he had strong grandparents who took him in after his mother could no longer do that, being addicted to drugs. And he applied to the Marines and then to law school. And Brian, so now the man that he was talking about, faces the same problem at about 5% chance of upward mobility out of just simple poverty. Not even to make, heaps of money, but just upward mobility. And is he able to change his environment enough? Vance knows that without the right environment or culture, Brian has very little chance of succeeding in this world. And is Vance himself enough to change the average of the people that Brian hangs out with? We know that mentorship really helps, but how much can it help? You might look at this and ask yourself, where did I grow up? And what were my chances like? I did that. So I grew up all over the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. But my mother, at age 11, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So we grew up from then on food stamps. We were on low-income housing, that sort of thing. So we were in that 20th percentile. But given where I grew up in the Pacific Northwest area, I had a much greater chance of exceeding that, of getting out of that than other people did. And I remember my mother, when we went to get low-income housing, she didn't just go anywhere. She went to Redmond, which is a suburb of Seattle. Most of you might know Redmond as the place where Microsoft is. This is a wealthy, very middle-class suburb of Seattle. So I got a good education there as well. My classmates were all middle-class and wealthy students. And I have exceeded my parents' own income. They were teachers. At least at some points in my life, I've exceeded them. But I'm not in the top 20%, certainly, but I have at times in my life made more than they did. So where you live, where you grow up, makes a huge difference. And who you're exposed to makes a huge difference. Environment matters. And can we use our environment to our advantage? And absolutely. It's important where kids grow up, but it's also important for us to each to grow, not just socioeconomically, but spiritually, in our work, in our personal lives. If we want to grow and learn and become the person we want to be, chances are we're going to have to step out of our comfort zone, at least on occasion. one of the things that they did in my seminary, which I'm really grateful for, they must have known all of this because we were asked to basically encounter new environments as part of our classes, to go out to new places and encounter people we didn't normally associate with. So for example, we have 2 different field placements we had to do in seminary, and the very first one is that you can't go to a church. You have to go someplace totally different. So I chose the King County Jail, which actually happened to be just down the road from where I lived, but it was definitely an environment and a population that I was not used to hanging out with. In one of the other places that I went to the Mount Zion Baptist Church. This is a Black evangelical church. Also very different from what I was used to. So then, when my teacher asked me, what would really push your buttons, Sean? I said, well, going to a Mormon church would really push my buttons. So my boss's boss, Don, if you remember, he was a Mormon, so he invited me to his church, which was very different from the Black church that I went to. Talk about different environments. We did all sorts of things that made me encounter new worldviews. I remember, for example, being challenged to listen to rap music, which I'd never really done, right? I was challenged to go to movies and to plays to see things that I wouldn't normally go and see or do unless I deliberately made the effort and I wanted to get an A in the class, which, of course. My parents were teachers. Of course I'm going to get an A. So why do you think my seminary would do that? Make us go outside of our comfort zones to new zones to encounter different people? It's because when we put ourselves in different environments, we encounter new worldviews, different ways of seeing the world. It's like walking into a room that you think you know well, but where the furniture is all rearranged. We all have these patterns of thinking, whether these are unconscious stereotypes about people or biases or prejudices. But when we break those patterns of thinking, it shakes up our nice, tidy worldview. We don't just change our habits, but we change how we actually see people. This in turn brings a level of complexity to the world that breaks down those barriers, that puts people in boxes and calls them other, right? Those other people. It breaks down stereotypes, and we see people fully as human beings in all their glorious complexity, rather than just one aspect, like their race, or their gender, or their orientation, or their ability, or whatever it is. And I remember that's what happened to me when I read the book Hillbilly Elegy. I never knew, and I never really understood the conservative Rust Belt area of our country. So seeing the world from their point of view, it was eye-opening for me and helpful in understanding why this last presidential election went the way that it did. It doesn't change my own politics, but it helped me understand and better able to address the concerns that those who do think differently from me, what those are. And what I found also is it gave me a new way of thinking that these people are not evil or stupid or ignorant or any of those things. They simply have a different worldview. I think the part of any church, and particularly I think of this church, is in a sense to help each of us break up our patterns of thinking so that we might learn to love better. I talked about that last week, that one of the purposes of church is to learn to love better. So the stories we tell, the readings, are all designed to bring in different worldviews to kind of change our mental environment. Just an hour a week, to bring something new to chew on. But stepping out of our comfort zone isn't always a guarantee that we'll learn something new. Sometimes the biggest problem is that when we walk swaggering into a new environment thinking we already know everything, we bring our unconscious biases with us into that new room. I think one of the great learnings of us Unitarian Universalists, particularly in this last, decade or so, is that we who come from predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly white middle-class environments, we had to learn that when working with the marginalized and oppressed, most of whom are white, and most of us who are now white middle class, was to leave our egos at the proverbial door, right? And simply listen to those who know their environments much better than we do. This week or this month, next month, I'd like to challenge you to do something that takes you out of your chosen environment. To meet or hang out with people you wouldn't normally hang out with. For those of you who are visitors, congratulations for coming to a new place. You're good. So meet with people you don't normally hang out. Learn something new. Talk to someone who is homeless. Discuss politics with someone who doesn't think like you. Reach out in small and large ways to, in a sense, to walk into a room where the furniture is rearranged. You know, we have a bunch of guests here today that are from our Long Beach church. Raise your hands if you're from Long Beach. These people are here to listen to us because they like to help us in Orange County to elect the right people in the right way of the laws that we have here. And of course, since we are a 501c, we cannot talk about specific people here, but they like to hear what you're doing and how they can help. And we're going to be talking about that after the service today. So they are, in a sense, living that wonderful way of stepping out of their own environment from Long Beach and coming here to ours to say, how can we help? Which I love that. And I believe that this is how we're going to build a new way. This is how we're going to build a world of justice and compassion, because both of those things need to go hand in hand. So let's build a new way, a new world. So come join me and let us sing.
Please stand in body and spirit.